Somewhere on a mountainside in Pyongan Province, winter 1951, a recovery team from the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps picked through aluminum skin and frozen hydraulic lines scattered across a half-kilometer of granite. The MiG-15 had come apart at altitude. That much was obvious from the debris pattern. What wasn't obvious was why. The aircraft's ASP-1N gun sight, cracked but largely intact, was still set to a convergence range of 400 meters. The pilot had been tracking something. The gun camera film, if it survived, was never catalogued in any record that has surfaced since. What did survive was the accident investigation file, and it is a strange document. The assessor, a Major Fyodor Shebanov, attached to the Corps technical staff, noted the airframe showed no evidence of structural failure prior to impact. No fatigue cracking in the wing spars, no turbine blade separation. The empennage had torn away cleanly, consistent with aerodynamic overstress at high speed, but that raised its own question. The MiG-15 was stressed to 7.5 Gs at combat weight. Shebanov calculated the breakup forces at somewhere north of 11 Gs. So what was this pilot doing that put 11 Gs on an airframe rated for 7.5? Shebanov's report uses a careful phrase. He wrote that the pilot appeared to have executed an evasive maneuver of extreme and unnecessary violence. Unnecessary. That word sat in a classified file for 4 decades. The pilot was Senior Lieutenant Grigory Oklopkov, 196th Fighter Aviation Regiment. He had 340 hours on type. He was a competent line pilot, 4 months into his combat rotation. He'd claimed 2 probable kills against F-80s and had been recommended for the Order of the Red Banner. His squadron commander described him as technically proficient and temperamentally steady, the kind of pilot you'd expect to survive a combat tour. He didn't survive this one, and the investigative file cannot coherently explain why. The MiG-15 he was flying, Bureau number 1315387, had 180 hours on the airframe, no prior battle damage. The Klimov VK-1 engine had been overhauled 60 hours prior and was running within all parameters at its last maintenance check. The aircraft was, by every measurable standard, in excellent condition. It was also, by every measurable standard, superior to anything the Americans were flying that month. It climbed faster, operated at a higher ceiling, and carried armament that outweighed the American guns by a factor of 4. The N-37 cannon alone threw a 37mm shell that weighed more than a pound. One hit could fold an F-86 in half. By the numbers, Oklopkov should have owned that piece of sky. The MiG-15 was the best fighter in Korea. The wreckage on that mountainside didn't care about numbers. Shebanov closed his report with a recommendation for additional training in combat maneuvering discipline, which was a polite Soviet way of saying the pilot panicked. But Shebanov was a structures man, not a tactician, and his conclusion missed something fundamental. Oklopkov wasn't the first. Between November 1950 and January 1952, the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps lost 71 MiG-15s in circumstances that did not fit the expected loss patterns. The losses couldn't be attributed to ground fire, mechanical failure, or the usual categories of pilot error, spatial disorientation, fuel mismanagement, weather. These were aircraft that went up against American sabers and came apart, or burned, or simply didn't come back, at ratios that Soviet planners had not predicted and could not initially explain. The MiG-15 was faster, climbed better, hit harder. Its pilots kept dying anyway. Why? The answer wasn't in the airframe. It wasn't in the engine specs or the armament tables, and the service ceiling charts offered nothing either. It was in a set of problems so deeply embedded in how Soviet pilots were selected, trained, and commanded that no engineering bureau could have fixed them. The MiG-15 was a brilliant machine. The system that selected, trained, and commanded its pilots had made that brilliance irrelevant. The Pentagon knew the MiG-15 existed before Korea. They just didn't believe it mattered. CIA assessments from 1949 acknowledged that the Soviets had produced a swept-wing jet fighter. But the analysis that accompanied this acknowledgement was dripping with a confidence that reads, in hindsight, like a clinical case study in institutional arrogance. The prevailing view, held at the air staff level, echoed in theater command, repeated until it calcified into doctrine, was that Soviet aviation technology lagged the United States by 5 to 8 years. Soviet metallurgy was primitive. Soviet aerodynamics were derivative. Their pilots were rigid, poorly trained products of a system that punished initiative, flying by rote, never deviating from prescribed tactics. All of this was either wrong or correct in ways that wouldn't matter for another 18 months. November 1st, 1950. A flight of P-51D Mustangs from the 18th Fighter Bomber Group was working close air support near Sinuiju, right along the Yalu River, flying at maybe 10,000 feet. The Mustang pilots were scanning the ground. They should have been scanning the sky. Lieutenant Commander William Ammann, Navy, flying an F-9F Panther from the USS Philippine Sea, had his own encounter that same week and later described the sensation of seeing a MiG-15 for the first time as watching something from another decade. The swept wings were the immediate shock. American pilots in Korea were flying Mustangs, Corsairs, Shooting Stars, all straight wing, all subsonic, designed with World War II assumptions baked into every rivet. The MiG-15 looked like it belonged to a different war entirely. So what happened when they actually fought? The first confirmed air-to-air engagement between a MiG-15 and an American jet came on November 8, 1950. Lieutenant Russell Brown, 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing, was flying an F-80C Shooting Star when he encountered a MiG-15 over the Chongchon River area. Brown fired, the MiG trailed smoke, and the Air Force credited him with the first jet versus jet kill in history. That story made headlines. The story that didn't make headlines was what happened in the weeks after. MiG-15s began appearing in groups of 4, then 8, then 16 or more, slashing down from 40,000 feet into American strike formations with a speed advantage so severe that the F-80 pilots couldn't track them visually before they were already through the formation and climbing away. The Shooting Star had a top speed of 594 miles per hour. The MiG-15 could do 668. That 74-mile-per-hour gap doesn't sound catastrophic on paper. In a diving attack from altitude, it meant the MiG was a blur, a gray smear that resolved into a shape only after it had already fired. Pilots reported hearing the cannon rounds before they saw the aircraft. The sound of a 37mm shell passing close enough to hear is not something you forget. One veteran described it as a tearing noise, like heavy canvas ripping, followed by a pressure change in the cockpit that made his ears pop. Within 2 weeks of sustained MiG-15 operations, the Air Force effectively lost air superiority over northwestern Korea. B-29 Superfortresses, the same aircraft that had burned Tokyo to the ground 5 years earlier, were getting shredded. On April 12, 1951, a formation of 48 B-29s headed for the bridges at Sinuiju. MiG-15s hit them in waves. The bombers' defensive .50 caliber guns, which had been adequate against propeller-driven interceptors, couldn't traverse fast enough to track jets closing at combined speeds over 1,000 miles per hour. 3 B-29s went down. 7 more limped home with damage severe enough to write them off. The Air Force called it Black Thursday and quietly suspended daylight strategic bombing in MiG Alley. The weapon that won the Pacific War had been rendered obsolete in a single afternoon by an aircraft the Pentagon had dismissed 18 months earlier. The F-86 Sabre deployment was already underway, but the timeline tells its own story. The 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing received its first F-86As at Johnson Air Base, Japan in mid-December 1950, rushed across the Pacific with a speed that reflected something close to institutional panic. Colonel Bruce Hinton scored the wing's first MiG kill on December 17th, and the initial engagements suggested the Sabre could match the MiG-15 in ways the Shooting Star never could. The swept wings were comparable. The speed differential shrank to almost nothing at medium altitude. The Sabre's hydraulically boosted flight controls gave it a handling quality at high Mach numbers that the MiG, with its manual, cable-actuated controls, couldn't replicate. At 0.8, 2 Mach and above, MiG pilots reported the stick forces becoming so heavy that deflecting the ailerons required both hands and a leg brace against the cockpit wall. But the Sabre wasn't better, not on paper. The MiG-15 still climbed faster, still flew higher, and its armament hit harder by an order of magnitude. The F-86A's 6.50 caliber M3 machine guns threw a lot of lead, but each round weighed barely an ounce and a half. Against an aircraft with armored cockpit plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, the Brownings needed sustained hits to kill. The MiG's single N-37 and twin NR-23s needed one good burst. Everything about the specification comparison favored the Soviet aircraft. The kill ratios favored the Americans. The machines weren't deciding these fights. The A-4 gun sight weighed 22 pounds. It sat on a mounting bracket above the instrument panel coaming, slightly left of center, and from the pilot's seat it looked like an oversized camera bolted where it didn't quite belong. The housing was matte black, roughly the size of a bread loaf, with a combining glass that projected an orange reticle onto the windscreen. Nothing about it looked revolutionary. Most pilots who transitioned to the F-86 from earlier jets barely mentioned it in their initial checkout notes. The swept wings, the powered controls, the transonic handling got all the attention. The gun sight was just a thing on the dashboard. It was the most important piece of equipment in the aircraft. So, what did the A-4 actually do? The AN/APG-30 radar unit, paired with the A-4 computing gun sight, solved a problem that had plagued aerial gunnery since 1915, the deflection shot. Hitting another aircraft in a turning fight requires aiming not where the target is, but where it will be when your bullets arrive. At jet speeds, with closure rates that could exceed 1,200 feet per second, the mathematical complexity of that prediction overwhelmed human intuition. A pilot pulling lead on a MiG-15 in a 4G turn at 500 miles per hour needed to place his rounds at a point in empty sky that his brain could not reliably calculate. Soviet pilots faced the same problem. Their ASP-3N gun sight was a fixed reticle system, essentially a set of concentric rings etched on glass, calibrated to a single assumed wingspan and a manually dialed range estimate. The pilot had to guess the distance to the target, twist a knob on the throttle quadrant to input that guess, then fly the aircraft so the target's wings touched the correct ring. In a stable, straight-line pursuit, this worked tolerably well. In a hard maneuvering fight at 0.85 Mach, it was almost useless. Colonel Yevgeny Pepelyaev, the top Soviet ace in Korea, 19 confirmed kills by Russian count, later admitted that most of his successful engagements were rear hemisphere attacks against non-maneuvering targets. When the American turned hard, he said, "The sight told me nothing." The A-4 didn't require guessing. The APG-30 radar painted the target with a continuous beam and fed range data, updated 400 times per second, directly into the computing gun sight. The gun sight then calculated bullet drop, time of flight, G-loading, aircraft speed, and the angular rate of the target's movement across the pilot's canopy. It moved the aiming reticle in real time. The pilot didn't solve the equation. He just kept the pipper on the target and pressed the trigger. The system did the rest. The difference in practical accuracy was staggering. USAF gunnery assessments from 1952 showed that F-86 pilots using the A4 system achieved hit rates between 16 and 24% in maneuvering combat, roughly 5 to 6 times the hit rate recorded by MiG-15 pilots using the ASP-3N under comparable conditions. 5 to 6 times. The plain arithmetic makes the gap worse. A MiG-15 carried 200 rounds for its N-37 cannon. At a 3 to 4% hit rate, a Soviet pilot could expect 6 to 8 impacts across an entire combat load, assuming he maintained firing solutions long enough to expend every shell. An F-86 pilot with 1,800 rounds of .50 caliber and a 20% hit rate could put 360 rounds into a target. The Browning's individual rounds were lighter, but 360 of them would reduce an airframe to confetti. The Soviets knew the Americans had a radar-ranging gun sight. Their intelligence directorate had flagged it as early as mid-1951. The assessment classified it as a minor refinement, providing marginal tactical benefit. They were wrong by a factor that would fill their own accident files for the next 2 years. September 1951. The kill ratios started showing up in the weekly intelligence summaries at 5th Air Force Headquarters in Taegu, and they didn't look like anything the operations staff had seen before. In the first full month of sustained Sabre versus MiG combat, the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing claimed 14 MiG-15s destroyed against 2 F-86s lost. By December, the monthly ratio had stretched to nearly 6 to 1. The Soviet 64th Corps was rotating fresh regiments into Manchurian bases at Antung and Mukden on 90-day cycles, and each new regiment arrived with the same confident briefings about the MiG-15's performance superiority. Each one bled at the same rate. Captain Nikolai Shalamanov, a flight leader in the 176th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, wrote to his wife in January 1952 that his regiment had lost 8 pilots in its first 40 days of operations. "We see them below us," he wrote, "and by the time we are among them, everything is confusion." That letter survived because Shalamanov didn't. His MiG was hit by an F-86E on February 3, 1952, during a diving attack on a Sabre formation near the Changjiang River. His wingman reported seeing the canopy shatter and the aircraft roll inverted before entering clouds at 12,000 feet. No ejection. So what were the Americans doing differently? The tactical pattern was almost always the same. Sabre flights operated in pairs, a lead and a wingman, stacked at altitudes between 35,000 and 42,000 feet along the southern edge of MiG Alley. They flew a racetrack pattern, burning fuel, waiting. When radar controllers at Chodo Island picked up MiG formations climbing out of Antung, the Sabres would turn north. The MiGs typically held a 5,000 to 8,000 foot altitude advantage at the merge. On paper, that should have been decisive. Energy is life in air combat, and altitude converts directly to speed. The Soviet pilots had been trained to exploit exactly this advantage, diving through the American formations, firing, then using their superior climb rate to zoom back to altitude for another pass. It was a sound tactic borrowed from Luftwaffe experience in World War II. The problem was what happened after the first pass. American flight leads would brake hard into the diving MiGs, forcing an overshoot, then roll wings level and pull into a pursuit curve as the MiG tried to extend. The MiG-E could outclimb the Sabre. It could not outdive it. Above 0.86 Mach, the MiG-15's controls locked up. The manual ailerons required forces exceeding 40 pounds just to hold a bank angle, and the elevator became so sensitive that small inputs produced violent pitch oscillations. Soviet pilots called it podkhvat, the snatch. You could feel it through the stick, a sudden heaviness in roll combined with a twitchy, almost alive quality in pitch, like the aircraft was deciding on its own where to point. The Sabre had none of these problems. Its hydraulic flight controls were linear across the entire speed range. At 0.92 Mach, where a MiG pilot was fighting his own aircraft with both hands, A Sabre pilot was tracking smoothly with fingertip pressure on the stick, the A-4 Pipper drifting onto the target, 6 Brownings waiting. The spring of 1953 produced the worst months the Soviet Fighter Corps had ever experienced in Korea. In April, Sabres from the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing and the 4th, now flying the upgraded F-86F with a new 6-3 wing that improved high-altitude maneuvering, claimed 27 MiG-15s destroyed in a single 30-day period. American losses for that month were 2 Sabres. Captain Joseph McConnell, who would finish the war as the top American ace with 16 kills, shot down 3 MiGs in a single day on May 18th. His gun camera footage from that afternoon survived. The 3rd MiG he engaged was in a hard left break at what the debrief estimated was .84 Mach. McConnell pulled inside the turn, closed to 1,200 feet, and fired a 2-second burst. The film shows pieces separating from the MiG's fuselage almost immediately. The computing gun sight had placed the rounds exactly where the aircraft was going to be. The entire engagement from first sighting to kill confirmation lasted 47 seconds. By the armistice in July 1953, the official USAF tally stood at 792 MiG-15s, destroyed against 78 Sabres lost, a 10-to-1 ratio. Soviet records, opened decades later, dispute the absolute numbers, but not the direction. Their own figures acknowledge a ratio of roughly 4-to-1 in American favor. Even the conservative number is a catastrophe for an aircraft that was supposed to be better. Antung Airfield, Manchuria, spring 1952. The smell hit new arrivals before anything else. Jet fuel, burnt rubber from tires that had been ridden hard on landings by pilots who hadn't mastered the MiG-15's notoriously stiff oleo struts, fire suppression foam that had been sprayed on the runway so often it had stained the concrete in long yellow streaks, and something else underneath all of it, sharp and chemical, that nobody bothered to identify. Replacement pilots stepping off transport aircraft at Antung were typically 23 or 24 years old. They had between 150 and 200 total flying hours. Maybe 40 of those hours were in the MiG-15. They had never fired the aircraft's weapons at a maneuvering target. Within 72 hours of arrival, most of them would fly their first combat sortie over MiG Alley. Why did Moscow do it this way? The Soviet rotation system was built around a logic that made perfect sense if you were a staff officer in the Kremlin, and no sense at all if you were a flight leader over the Yalu. The 64th Fighter Aviation Corps operated on 90-day deployment cycles. An entire regiment would rotate in, fly combat for 3 months, then rotate home and be replaced by a fresh unit. The official rationale was twofold: spread combat experience across the maximum number of units, and prevent any single regiment from accumulating losses severe enough to affect morale. In practice, it meant that every 90 days, the entire Soviet fighter force in Korea reset to 0. Hard-won tactical knowledge about Sabre engagement profiles, a 4-gun sight capabilities, the way American flights split into independent 2-ship elements at the merge, all of it walked out the door with the departing regiment. The replacement unit arrived with briefing documents that were already outdated and an institutional confidence that the MiG-15's specification sheet would carry them through. Lieutenant Colonel Semyon Fedorets, who commanded a squadron in the 196th Fighter Aviation Regiment during its 1952 rotation, noted in his after-action report that his pilots EQ'd prescribed tactical formations, the rigid 4-ship fingertip that Soviet doctrine mandated, because they had been taught nothing else. He requested an extension to overlap with the incoming regiment and provide tactical mentorship. The request was denied. His regiment departed Antung on schedule. The unit that replaced them lost 4 pilots in its first week. The Americans did the opposite. A Sabre pilot assigned to the 4th or 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing flew a full combat tour, typically 100 missions, which could stretch across 8 to 12 months. He arrived green and flew his first missions on the wing of an experienced flight lead. He learned by watching, by listening in debriefs, and by not dying. By his 30th or 40th mission, he was a competent combat pilot. By mission 70, he was dangerous. By mission 100, he was precisely the kind of opponent the Soviet system was designed to never produce. The RAF had learned this lesson over Britain in 1940. When Fighter Command realized that a pilot who survived his first 5 sorties had a dramatically higher chance of surviving his next 50. Experience compounds. The survival curve is not linear. It is exponential. And the first 20 hours of combat flying are where nearly all the dying happens. The Soviet pilots were permanently stuck in those first 20 hours. Colonel Yevgeny Pepelyaev understood this better than anyone in the 64th Corps. His personal kill count proved what a skilled Soviet pilot could do in the MiG-15. 19 victories made him the highest-scoring Soviet ace of the war. But Pepelyaev had over 4,000 flying hours, including World War II combat time against the Luftwaffe. He was the exception that proved what the rule actually cost. When he watched replacement pilots taxi out for their first combat missions, he could see the mistakes before they happened. The too tight formation spacing that would collapse into confusion at the merge. The way they'd fixate on a single target and go blind to everything else, including the wingman's saber sliding into firing position behind them. He described the sound of the radio during those engagements as shouting and breathing, and then silence. One by one, call signs stopped transmitting. The debrief rooms afterward had a particular quality. The surviving pilots sitting on metal chairs, flight suits dark with sweat, hands still trembling from adrenaline and G-forces, trying to reconstruct what had happened in a fight that lasted less than 2 minutes. The regimental commander would ask questions. The answers were almost always the same. They didn't see the saber until it was already firing. The rounds came from a direction they weren't looking, and their wingman was there, and then he wasn't. Moscow reviewed the loss reports quarterly. The training pipeline remained unchanged for the duration of the war. July 27, 1953, 10 p.m. The guns stopped. Along the front lines, the silence had a physical weight to it. A pressure change, almost, like something had released in the atmosphere and not come back. In the revetments at Antung, the remaining MiG-15s of the 64th Corps sat in their blast pens with engine covers fitted and wheel chocks in place, and ground crews stood around in the strange stillness of an airfield that wasn't generating sorties. Some of them smoked. The smell of avgas still hung over everything, baked into the concrete by 2 years of continuous operations. But there was no kerosene exhaust now, no turbine whine spooling up in the pre-dawn dark. Crickets and cigarette smoke, and somewhere a radio murmuring to itself. Then the counting started, and the counting was where it got ugly. The USAF claimed 792 MiG-15s, destroyed in air-to-air combat against 78 Sabres lost. That clean 10-to-1 ratio that would headline American aviation journals for the next decade. The Soviets, when they finally opened their archives in the 1990s, claimed they had lost 335 aircraft and shot down 640 American planes of all types. The numbers don't reconcile, and they never will. Both sides overcounted kills. This is universal in air combat, not unique to Korea. Gun camera film is ambiguous. A smoking aircraft isn't necessarily a dead aircraft. Multiple pilots engage the same target and each claims it. What matters is that even the most conservative analysis, conducted by researchers with access to both archives, settles on a ratio somewhere between 3-to-1 and 4-to-1 in favor of the Sabre. The Israelis would encounter something similar 2 decades later when their Mirage 3s met Egyptian MiG-21s over the Sinai in 1967, achieving lopsided kill ratios that couldn't be explained by airframe performance alone. Pilot quality, tactical flexibility, institutional learning, and systems integration all pointed the same direction. Korea wasn't an anomaly. The same structural failures produced the same results. Inside the Soviet military establishment, the post-Korea assessment read like a document written by men who understood exactly what had gone wrong and chose not to say so. The 64th Corps' final operational report, compiled in late 1953, attributed losses primarily to numerical American superiority in the combat zone and the enemy's willingness to accept unfavorable tactical positions. The report mentioned the A-4 computing gun sight exactly once in a footnote, describing it as an automated aiming assistance device of limited proven effectiveness. The training rotation system received no criticism whatsoever. It had been approved at the ministry level, and criticizing ministry-level decisions was not a career-enhancing activity in Stalin's Air Force, or, after March 1953, in Khrushchev's. General Lobov, who commanded the 64th Corps during its final year of operations, submitted a supplementary assessment recommending fundamental changes to pilot training hours, weapons employment curricula, and formation tactics. The supplementary assessment was received and filed without further action. Lobov was reassigned to a staff position in Moscow. His recommendations surfaced again, almost word for word, in a 1958 review of Soviet fighter readiness, attributed to a different author. None of this made it into the official reports, but the pilots remembered. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Naboka, who survived a full rotation with the 176th Guards and returned to the Soviet Union in the summer of 1952, told an interviewer decades later that he dreamed about the Yalu River for years afterward. Not the combat, the river, the silver-green line of it below him as he crossed into MiG Alley, the moment when the radio chatter picked up and you knew the Sabres were already airborne and climbing, waiting somewhere in that enormous blue emptiness above North Korea. He said the worst part wasn't the fear during the fight. It was the taxi back to the flight line afterward, counting the aircraft in the landing pattern, doing the arithmetic in his head before anyone said a word. 2 went out as a 4-ship. The MiG-15 was the finest fighter the Soviet Union had ever built. The Kremlin spent 40 years refusing to ask the obvious follow-up. Did the finest fighter matter at all when the system flying it was broken from the ground up? What did the Americans actually take away from Korea? The kill ratio wasn't the point. The ratio was a headline, useful for congressional budget hearings and aviation magazine covers. But the officers at Tactical Air Command, who spent 1954 and 1955 dissecting the air war over MiG Alley, weren't interested in headlines. They were interested in why. Colonel Francis Gabreski, 6 kills in Korea on top of 28 in World War II, put it bluntly in a 1956 lecture at the Air War College. The MiG was a better airplane in most respects. He told a room full of officers who didn't want to hear it. We won because we flew better and shot better, and because we adapted faster than they did. If you think that's permanent, you're going to get people killed. The lecture wasn't classified. It should have been required reading for every aircraft procurement office in the building. The principle Gabreski was articulating, that systems integration defeats specifications, became the intellectual backbone of American fighter development for the next 7 decades. The F-15 wasn't designed to be the fastest jet in the sky. It was designed to let its pilot fight effectively across the widest possible envelope, with radar that actually worked, controls that didn't betray him at the edges of the flight regime, a weapon system that multiplied whatever skill he brought to the cockpit, and enough fuel to stay in the fight. The Soviets responded with the MiG-25, faster, higher flying, built around specifications that looked devastating on paper. When Lieutenant Viktor Belenko defected to Japan in 1976, American engineers pulled the panels off and found vacuum tubes in the avionics. The top speed was impressive. The pilot workload bordered on unmanageable. The pattern kept repeating. The Bekaa Valley in 1982 showed the same thing when Israeli F-15s and F-16s destroyed 82 Syrian MiG-21s and MiG-23s without a single air-to-air loss. Syrian pilots had trained in the Soviet system, flew Soviet doctrine, rotated through units the Soviet way. Iraq in 1991 made it worse. The ratio was even more lopsided. 33 Iraqi aircraft shot down against 0 American losses in air combat. Different decade, different theater, same outcome. Airframes changed, missiles changed, decades passed. The fundamental asymmetry between a system that empowered its pilots and a system that constrained them did not. But the cost of proving this was real, and it was paid in specific. 58 American pilots and aircrew died in air-to-air combat over Korea. Their names exist in files at the National Archives, typed on onion skin paper that's yellowing at the edges now. First Lieutenant Howard Miller, Captain Albert Smiley. Names that don't appear in the histories that focus on McConnell's 16 kills or Jabara's triple ace status. The victory was real. The price was paid one name at a time. On the Soviet side, the accounting was worse and slower to surface. The 64th Corps lost somewhere between 120 and 170 pilots, killed over the course of the war. The exact figure depends on which Russian source you trust, and they don't agree with each other. Many of those men were buried in Chinese cemeteries near Antung under markers that identified them only by rank, because the Soviet Union officially had no combat forces in Korea. Their families received letters that said their sons had died in training accidents. Some of those families didn't learn the truth until the 1990s. August 1953. Kimpo Air Base, South Korea, 1 week after the armistice. The 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing was still flying, not combat missions. Patrol sorties along the ceasefire line, 2 ship formations cruising at 38,000 feet, with nothing on the radar and nothing on the radio except position checks. Captain Ralph Gibson, 87 combat missions, 2 confirmed kills, a DFC he hadn't bothered to pin on yet, strapped into his F-86F on a Tuesday morning, ran through the pre-flight checklist the same way he'd done it 86 times before, and taxied to the runway. The crew chief gave him the standard thumbs up from the revetment. Gibson pushed the throttle forward, felt the Sabre accelerate down the concrete, rotated, and climbed north toward a border that was still warm.